listener production.
Hey, Tara Cassidy with you and welcome to The Briefing. Police are cracking down on a mounting movement in Australia that's causing chaos in communities, courtrooms, and with followers who believe they're above the law. Earlier this week, authorities in WA seized over 100 firearms in targeted raids of sovereign citizens, with similar operations expected nationwide, while the state's police minister says the risk of allowing people with such beliefs to own guns is too high.
The law was corrupted, and now the government is run by wicked forces who are tyrannical and despotic. And at this point, they sort of say, well, I am essentially a martyr. Sometimes it does stretch into violence, extreme violence.
That chat with a sovereign citizen expert is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Chris Spiru. It's Wednesday, the 8th of October.
Hey Tara, and to you listening. Starting overseas, where 7 Australians detained by Israeli forces in international waters west of Gaza have been released and deported to Jordan. The activists were part of a global flotilla of more than 40 vessels trying to break Israel's blockade on the region last week by bringing a symbolic cargo of aid into the Strip.
We can see soldiers now at the back. See soldiers at the back there. So I would say that it's almost certain that we're being boarded, guys.
The Australian government has raised concerns this week over their treatment in a prison in the Israeli desert after they had made statements saying they had been beaten, denied food, clean water and medication, deprived of sleep and threatened with sexual assault, claims Israeli authorities say are fake news. So far, at least 341 of the 479 flotilla participants detained by Israel have been deported, including Greta Thunberg, who we heard from yesterday.
Let me be very clear. There is a genocide going on in front of our very eyes. No one has the privilege to say we are not aware of what is happening. Under international law, states have a legal obligation to act to prevent and to stop a genocide from happening.
The return comes as the Netanyahu government has demanded Anthony Albanese get the country in order after a spate of anti-Semitic incidents yesterday on the second anniversary since the October 7 Hamas attacks. In Melbourne, the words "Glory to Hamas" were spray painted on a Fitzroy billboard and "October 7 do it again" on a nearby Officeworks. While in Sydney, 2 men were arrested yesterday after one of them was allegedly spotted pointing a firearm from a moving truck towards a Cremorne synagogue. Both the driver, 21, and passenger, 23, have since been released. The Prime Minister has labelled the graffiti in Melbourne as abhorrent and says the AFP is working with Victoria Police as the investigation there continues.
It was a tense morning for government officials who were dragged over the coals in a heated Senate estimate which heard accusations of cover-ups and inaction over serious sexual assault allegations. Yesterday at the hearing, the federal government faced pressure to respond to the more than 300 allegations of sexual harassment and assault from minors who've alleged abuse from their adult male driving instructors across the country. National Senator Bridget McKenzie questioned the Department of Transport over whose responsibility it felt the matters were and why it hadn't done more to tackle the problem.
It's one thing for the Minister King to say she's appalled. It's another thing to get off your ass and actually do something about it.
Minister Anthony Chisholm, who was representing Transport Minister Catherine King, responded saying it wasn't a federal matter, but the government was willing to support state and territories. However, victims are calling for a nationwide coordinated approach. Meanwhile, in a separate war of words, Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who was fronting the hearing on behalf of the Prime Minister, has been accused of dodging basic questions about how 6 wives and children of Islamic State or ISIS fighters were allegedly able to return to Australia from Syria.
Does the Prime Minister himself know how many ISIS brides are now in Australia?
Well, I'll take that. I think I've taken that question on notice, Chair.
It comes after Anthony Albanese denied the group was set to return here by the end of the year as part of a secret operation, with Penny Wong saying the government didn't provide assistance.
Yeah, and when grilled further over whether providing passports and citizenship constituted assistance, the minister said the government was obliged and that shouldn't be seen as providing support.
If there are public servants, officials, who are undertaking their duties and obligations to Australian citizens in line with Australian law, that is what that is. It is officials doing what they are required to do as public servants.
Without passport, without citizenship by descent,
you can't enter Australia or a visa, and so you do need to be assisted to enter Australia by obtaining those documents from the government. Isn't that assistance?
Well, we have a different view on that.
Meanwhile, Shadow Foreign Affairs Minister Michaelia Cash accused Minister Wong and the PM of taking part in a cover-up, saying Australians deserve to know how they're being protected from a, quote, dangerous cohort of individuals who aligned themselves with barbaric fighters.
Yeah, and look, we did do a deep dive on this not too long ago. I'll pop a link to that in the show notes. But essentially the reason the government has stayed a little quiet on this is because last time we did have a repatriation of ISIS brides and their families, quote unquote, there was a whole media circus surrounding it, and that really impacted their reintegration. So essentially the government saying here, lessons have been learnt and we're changing tact. And look, a lot of experts have come out to say that it is best to deal with these families in Australian environments through our programs and judicial system, as opposed to leaving them there in Syria where they're at risk of potential radicalisation or even death.
Yeah, and look, I think on the other foot, though, there are portions of the public that would disagree with that stance and say that they shouldn't be afforded the right and allowed back into Australia, period, just because they did choose to support ISIS. And so then part of this criticism has been not just about knowing what the government did, but just that it's happening at all.
Women have a much greater genetic risk of developing depression than males, according to new research. The study, involving nearly 500,000 people, found almost twice as many changes in DNA that could cause major depressive disorder in women only. The research, published in the Nature Communications journal, also found the way women and men experience depression differs and pointed to why women may endure metabolic symptoms, including changing energy levels and weight.
The study is the largest of its kind to look at both men and women, assessing hundreds of thousands of people, both with and without depression. It also found that many of the genetic red flags people are born with, as opposed to being changes that happen during their life because of things like their experiences or trauma. Now, this research could help pave the way for future treatment, with most drug trials and therapies to date only tested on men.
We're not saying that females or males have it worse, but what we're saying is that it's different. Depression looks very different from one person to another, and an important aspect of that is the sex differences that's been overlooked for a long time.
That was a researcher from QIMR Berghofer who took part in this study. Now, scientists say it could mean men and women need to receive entirely different treatment for depression in future.
Hundreds of Aussie riders could be eligible for a cut of an almost $2.3 billion settlement after an AI class action was settled in the States. The landmark case was brought by authors against tech company Anthropic for using more than 500,000 books without permission to train its AI, or large language model. A reminder, this is the same large language model that resorted to blackmail in testing to avoid being shut down, which we have done a deep dive on, and I will pop a link to that in the show notes.
Now, Anthropic has agreed to pay riders around $4,500 for each stolen title, a payment that would have to be shared with publishers. Now, on the list of stolen books is Trent Dalton's Boy Swallows Universe, that has since been made into that hit Netflix series, his follow-up, All Our Shimmering Skies, as well as Andy Griffith and Terry Denton's 26-story Treehouse, and others from Helen Garner. The AI developer has also agreed to destroy the original pirated files and copies it made, though it does keep any books it purchased legitimately. Writers who think they may be eligible for a payment have until March 23 next year to submit a claim, with a full list of works used available now.
And now that it's heating up, do any of you plan on working from home just so you can sneak off an hour early or two for an afternoon of relaxation? Well, if you do, you're not alone, with a new survey finding more than 50% of Aussies think it is okay to clock off early and hit the beach during the warmer months.
Oh, well, and that's according to a poll by 9 News, which included more than 500 Aussies, and also found 1 in 4 of us are fine with stretching our lunch breaks to enjoy good weather while working from home. 40% of us want more relaxed rules over the summer, like half-day Fridays. I mean, I can get around that. And a third of us think we should be allowed to work from the beach or outdoors when it's hot. I mean, I think people are doing this with or without permission. You've seen some of those photos where people are on their laptops at the beach.
Yeah, I mean, if you guys hear the beautiful sounds of summer, if you hear crushing waves and beautiful wind in the next few weeks, know that I have followed through with this and I am doing headlines from the sand. I think it'll be beautiful. Now, that is it for headlines for today. Coming up next is your deep dive, Tara, on sovereign citizens and why we're not going to arrest our way out of this growing movement. Have a listen to that deep dive. It is coming up for you next.
Radical US-based anti-authority movement.
People who believe the law doesn't apply to them.
I'm not lawfully required to.
I don't need to answer your questions. No.
For years, experts have warned of the dangers of the so-called sovereign citizen movement.
Filthy, corrupt, disgusting, lawless predators.
That was the voice of Desi Freeman, the fugitive who's thrust the sovereign citizen movement back into the spotlight after he allegedly shot dead 2 police officers, sparking a weeks-long interstate manhunt. And while he's just one subscriber, authorities and experts say he's certainly not alone, with a growing number of people now believing in the pseudo-law, which is causing chaos in the community and courtrooms and emboldening members who justify violence. Here to discuss this topic today is sovereign citizen and pseudo-law expert Dr Harry Hobbs from the University of New South Wales. Harry, thank you so much for joining me on the briefing today. Can you start by telling me a bit about what exactly a sovereign citizen is and what they believe?
Yeah, so the language of sovereign citizen came from the United States, and it grew out of this far-right militia, Christian identity, white supremacist, anti-Semitic groups, all this sort of really kind of far-right, pretty awful milieu, I suppose, that was percolating around the Midwest and the rest of the US in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Around the time of the global financial crisis, it kind of went international, exploded. And we saw people coming from the US coming to Australia to teach attendees, to teach seminars about how you can avoid paying your mortgage, how you can avoid having to register your vehicle, all this sort of stuff. It sort of exploded in popularity at an international level. And since COVID again, it's gone even further, right? The language we often describe in Australia is pseudo-law because we don't really have that same far-right militia movement background in Australia, but certainly that same sort of ideas that were percolating in the 80s and 70s and 90s in the US are now kind of prevalent in Australia as well. At its core is the idea that you can pick and choose what laws you want to follow. And so authority, federal government authority is unconstitutional. The local level is the most supreme version of the law, the only legitimate form of authority. But equally, all law is a form of contract. If I haven't individually consented to be bound by that law, I don't need to follow it.
And we have seen this movement make headlines a lot in recent weeks, and that's been largely because of fugitive Desi Freeman, who describes himself as a sovereign citizen. What can you tell me about their beliefs when it comes to things like violence and resisting authorities?
Yeah, so they have this narrative that says at one stage the law was good and just, and that was represented by something like the Magna Carta, for example. You may have seen during the pandemic people saying that the Magna Carta means I don't need to wear a mask or I don't need to get vaccinated, some sort of ancient, archaic legal instrument that doesn't really have any force or legitimacy or relevance really in Australia in the legal sense. This document means that I don't need to do X, Y, or Z. So they say at one stage the law was good and just, but then at one moment there was some sort of incident that corrupted the state. And so it might be Gough Whitlam introducing the Royal Title and Styles Act, which changed the Queen of England to the Queen of Australia. It might be moving to decimal currency. It might be removing the gold standard on our currency. At some moment, the law was corrupted, and now the government is run by wicked forces who are tyrannical and despotic. And at this point, they sort of say, well, I am essentially a martyr, one person fighting the wicked deep state, to use that language. And so the idea being that, if the police or if the state actors try to interfere with me, I am duty bound. I have the right law beside me. It is righteous for me to defend myself. Now, self-defense, is a very slippery concept, right? And so sometimes it does stretch into violence, extreme violence. And we see that particularly in the United States, where there have been more than 150 shootings or murders that I've seen that have been documented to the sovereign citizen movement. But in Australia, we've seen sort of pockets of this happening here and there.
And so do you think that for them violence, even as far as murder, is justified if they, say, doing it in the name of their beliefs and they're resisting this, like you said, evil authority?
At the extreme end, yes, the narrative does say that you have the right to defend yourself, protect yourself, and that could be whatever the person, the adherent, individually believes, right? And so if it's police coming onto your property, that is sort of a very core part of their idea of property, of their identity, of who they are, and then they feel that they have the right to do that. But that's the very extreme end. The vast majority of people who engage in pseudo-law beliefs or who act on these arguments I would say, are kind of more naive. People are going through a jam, I suppose. They've got a financial crisis, there may be a family breakdown, maybe they have lost their license in a traffic stop, and they're just kind of searching for an answer to get them out of the problem that they're facing. And they'll look online and they'll find people say, hey, if you use this one simple trick, you don't have to worry about registering your vehicle and you don't just have to consent to following the road rules, and therefore you can continue to drive as you're doing normally. And so most people, if you're thinking rationally, you think, well, that doesn't make sense, right? But sometimes if you're in a particular jam and it's feels very scary or very confronting or very isolating, you can see how you might get caught up in this idea and think, well, this is the solution that I need, and you act on it. Now, those people were not violent, so the violence is a very extreme end, but of course it's the stuff that captures attention because it is so dangerous and so scary.
And so what's then happening when people with these beliefs are being dealt with in our regular legal system? Like, what kind of issues are arising?
A lot of issues, and there's people going to court, but it's also engaging with local councils, going with ombudsman, going, birth, death, marriages, all of these things. Anywhere where the state intersects with the citizen, there's the potential for difficult involvement, I suppose, or difficult engagement. Generally speaking, people are very confrontational, very assertive, which sort of moves a little bit, slips into aggressiveness at times. But basically what happens is it's just really gumming up the works, throwing sand in the gears of justice or the administration of governance. When you turn up to court, a matter might be 20 minutes, but it pushes out to 4-6 hours because you've got to take so long to engage with these people. They'll send 200, 300 pages of documents the judge needs to read very carefully to make sure there's no real issue there. That takes time, pushes out civil justice timetables, makes everything take a lot longer and just adds more cost on people. They refuse to pay rates for local councils. They have local councils. The councils then need to decide whether they're going to do enforcement actions, take them to court. All this stuff just takes time and energy and wastes a lot of resources. So really we've seen a huge strain on the administration of justice.
I'd read that had escalated actually to even reports of violence and threats against magistrates and judges just in the last week or so.
Yes, absolutely. I've been talking to judges the last 12 months and heard a lot of anecdotal evidence where people say, and they've told me, where someone in rural courtrooms particularly, where there's not a lot of security or any security in some cases, people were turning up with a loaded pistol in their bum bag. Someone who was turning up to court routinely, they didn't have a matter, but they would turn up every day, sit in the public gallery and stare at the magistrate in a very intimidating fashion. It's happening a lot at the intimidating level. I recently conducted a survey of judges, court staff, sheriff officers about their experiences engaging with people that had pseudo-law beliefs in the court systems. It's kind of sense like, is this a big problem? What sort of problem is it causing? And they said, look, the mountains of documents that they send really are gumming up the works. But the bigger challenge they found was just the behaviour of these people. And so they would be very assertive, very aggressive, very confrontational in court. They would be acting in an intimidating fashion as well. And this sort of stuff is very confronting, has a potential in my mind to seep into violence. Just the everyday aspects of it has a low level of violence, I suppose.
And the data also shows us that there's been double the number of sovereign citizens facing certain courts in recent years compared to, say, the year prior. What do you think is behind the rise in these kinds of pseudo-law movements, and is it a sign of something?
Data is often hard to get because if you look at reported judgments, they don't always engage with whether the person is a pseudo-law adherent or not. They don't always give you that detail. And also, we've got to remember that the reported judgments are at the higher court levels, but the lower-level courts are where this really happens and it's getting absolutely slammed. And so magistrates, local court judges are saying that this is just escalated, huge rise since COVID, really is the crux point in Australia. And they say that it hasn't gone back to pre-COVID levels, so it remains elevated. I don't know if this clear data exists, but I would say, substantial rise. Our study in South Australia showed that for some people at the local court level, this is a everyday thing, or, a one every 2 or 3 days, they're getting one person making these arguments turning up to court. People always ask, why do people do this if it never works? And we should be clear, no court has ever accepted one of these arguments. The argument that Magna Carta means you don't need to pay your mortgage, or the argument that you can pick and choose what laws to follow. No court in the world has ever accepted this. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, where have you, no court ever. So why do people do it, right? It works for them, but it works in a different way. It's about maintaining a sense of power and control, or reasserting power and control. It's being able to tell the judge that, you know what's right and you've got the correct secret knowledge and the judge is wrong and everybody's wrong, but you're the one in control here. And so I think that's why we see it particularly in traffic offences where someone's going to lose their licence, they might lose their job, they might lose their home. We see it a lot in family breakdowns where the sense of identity and even just financial security is at risk. We see it really in COVID because this is the moment where suddenly people thought, I'm losing control over my life. I don't know what's going on. Maybe I'm going to lose my job. We've got all these restrictions. I can't leave my local government area. I can't even go outside to talk to my friend. Something's gone wrong. There really is a tyrannical state that is imposing its will against me. And I need to kind of have some sense of authority and control over my life. And so this is why pseudo-law gurus, the people who make money selling this stuff, were able to widen their market.
And what do you think the solution is to combating this problem?
Yeah, this is the million-dollar question. And I don't think it's a legal problem. I think that this is a societal problem, right? People are attracted to this ideology or this belief system because they want some sense of authority and control over their lives. They end up getting funneled through the court because it's described as pseudo-law, right? Because it affects the legal system. It's coming up the administration of justice most primarily. But that means judges really are the ones dealing with them, and they're not really capable of solving social problems or solving broader problems. And so often the people who turn up in court making these arguments have got a real problem. They may be facing a family breakdown. They may be about to lose their license and they're worried they're going to lose their job in their home. Those aren't really legal problems. They're social problems. They're financial problems. They're institutional problems. So the solution has to be a lot broader. That's hard. That's expensive. That's difficult, right? There's no silver bullet. But I think some things we can do on the legal side is that we can make law more accessible. We can make it seem less foreign, less alienating for people. Lawyers often speak in kind of very ritualized performances, right? You sort of stand up, people might wear wigs or robes, you make some long-winded arguments that are hard to understand. And for people who have no legal literacy or no legal knowledge, this looks strange. And they think, well, why is this strange gobbledygook argument accepted by the court, but my argument that looks a lot like law and uses a lot of similar legal sounding language, why is that seen as ridiculous? And so I think there's that challenge where you've got to try and explain how law operates, how law works, but also make it much more accessible. But certainly I think the answer is a lot broader. We need to sort of make sure that legal education is broader. We need to make sure that support services are better. But also I think we just need to understand that a lot of people get attracted to this because they're looking for support and an empathetic community in a moment of crisis. And, we're much more atomized, we're much more alienated from each other now. If we're going through a problem, we deal with it individually and we don't deal with it in a community sense. But then you have these people online or these people in other communities who are saying, we see you, we support you, we want to help you. Here's the solution. The solution that they're offering is bogus. But if you're going through a problem, if one community of people seem like they want to help you, I think it's natural that you'll gravitate to them.
Really interesting insight, Harry. Thanks very much for joining me on the briefing today.
Thanks, Tara.
That was sovereign citizen expert Dr Harry Hobbs speaking with me there. And that's it for this episode of The Briefing. If you found this ep interesting, don't forget to leave us a comment or a review, or you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. I'm Tara Cassidy. See you next time.